Well, good morning to people in YouTube land. So, last Sunday I talked a little bit about, what did I talk about? Catholic and Buddhist monks talking
yes.
about some aspects of them that are very similar. And I want to talk a little bit today about, again, sort of a history comparative lifestyle thing. In the United States, to my way of thinking, now people could disagree with me and I wouldn't argue with them about it, but having worn the robe for a few decades, my impression is that most of the Buddhist centers in America that are run by Americans are of Japanese influence. What I mean by that is a Japanese teacher came over here back in perhaps the 50s and or 60s and established these centers, and then their descendants, their religious descendants, took over and now they're run by Americans. But the flavor is very much Japanese. Now, I'm excluding ethnic temples. The Chinese in California have built. At the time they built it, they said it was the largest Chinese-style temple in the Western world. And I don't know if that's changed, but it's very impressive, very beautiful, very big, and very Chinese. And of course we have the Jodo Shin, which is the Pure Land school out of Japan, that have built these gorgeous temples, just like you see in the pictures of Japan. And Hawaii has quite a few of them because the Japanese would go there to work in the fields, harvesting sugarcane and pineapple, and then they would work there for a year or two, save up their money and go back to Japan and do what people that have a lot of money do when they go back to their country. And so they built these incredible temples. Most of them are empty now. Some of them are actually starting to be torn down and apartment buildings put up on this very expensive land. They built beautiful temples like that here. I call those ethnic temples. The Japanese temples, at least in the past, maybe it's changing now, but they really were not interested in teaching their Buddhism to Americans, and this was reinforced by the fact that their services were never in English, they were in Japanese. They brought priests over here from Japan who would bring their families, and I'll get into that in a second. But they would teach in Japanese, and the first generation Japanese, not first generation, the first immigrants from Japan, learned just a minimal amount of English, like most immigrants do, to get by in the economy and the culture. And of course we have the Vietnamese now, which are a very large presence. The largest contingency of Vietnamese outside of Vietnam are in Orange County, California. And the second largest is in San Jose, California, and the third largest is around Paris in France. And so we're not counting those temples, but you should know that most of those temples, up until recently, everything was done in Vietnamese. They did not want to exclude Americans. It's just that's what the people spoke that came that established the temples. And if you think about it, temples are built by middle-aged and older people. They're not built by kids, because kids are going through college and getting out and establishing careers and starting families and maybe buying a house for the family to live in. They don't have a lot of money. But by the time they hit middle age, they're comfortable and they're able to support the monks in the temples, and they build beautiful temples in the memory of the Buddha. And in Buddhism, it's very important to support the religion financially, the monks, because the monks typically have nothing. They, as I said last week, talking about the Franciscans and Buddhist monks, they take a vow of poverty, so they don't, it's kind of hard for them to do anything like, buy anything, buy a piece of land, so they need the help of the laity. And the famous monk Thich Nhat Hanh talks about that's a laity's purpose, is to support the monks, both to buy them food and to help them have things like temples and places to sleep, and places to worship. So, let's go back to Japan. I'm writing a book very sporadically, and the last time I sat down to work on it, I started talking about the Japanese influence of Buddhism in this country. And it's something that's good for Buddhists to be aware of, because in Japan, there's not a lot of people going to the temples. It's not like Vietnam, where people go to the temples all through the year. They go through multiple holidays. Rites of passage are celebrated there. Famous monks, well-known monks, put on retreats that might be as long as a week long, and hundreds of people go to these retreats in Vietnam. The temple and Buddhism is tremendously important in Vietnam. I was explaining to some Americans a few years ago that considered themselves Buddhist and had never been in a temple. They had gone to meditation centers where all they did was meditate. The American there, who was not a monk, would give a talk on the practice of meditation, and they would go home and they considered themselves Buddhist. I would not tell them they're not Buddhist, but most of them know very little about Buddhism, because these lay people who are not monks are not teaching Buddhism, they're teaching meditation. This is an important distinction, that the Buddhism that arrived here isn't really Buddhism, by my reckoning. We have on one end of the pole, we have Vipassana meditation. We have multiple Vipassana meditation centers across America, and all the teachers there are lay people. None of them are ordained. Now, many of them have gone to Southeast Asia and stayed there for 6 months or a year, sometimes as long as a year and a half, at a meditation center. Most of them don't speak the language. Makes it kind of difficult to learn the fine nuances of the religion. They do some very intense meditation. They feel very positive about it. They come back here and they start teaching Americans how to do meditation. And meditation is a powerful thing. Meditation used properly can solve a lot of problems. Doctors in this country are in the habit now, it's very common for them to recommend that people that have problems with depression, anxiety, and a whole bunch of mental issues, but basically depression and anxiety, high blood pressure, things like that, recommend to their patients that they learn some meditation. They don't tell them to learn Buddhist meditation, but they tell them that you should learn some meditation. Now, you can go to a yoga studio and learn meditation. You can start doing Tai Chi like I do, or did until the pandemic with other people. It's a form of meditation. Qigong is also related to Tai Chi, a form of meditation. Even martial arts, if they're taught by a good teacher, can become a form of meditation for you. When I got back from Asia, I went to practice with a Japanese man in Orange County that taught Aikido, because I had learned that in Asia. And he started every session with 15 minutes of meditation. It's the first thing you did. You had to learn to settle and become centered before you began doing the martial art. So meditation can help your health, mental and physical health, but you're not practicing Buddhism, you're practicing meditation. And you're practicing a healthy lifestyle, I should say. I would never, and have never in all my life, proselytized Buddhism. I have never told anybody that they would be more happy in their life if they learned the stories of the Buddha, learned his recommendations for life. I've just never done it. Buddhism does not proselytize. But I have proselytized meditation. I've taught meditations to Protestants and Catholics and Jews. And it never crossed my mind to try to teach them Buddhism, because all they wanted was some meditation. And the last person I worked with, Mung will understand this, We have a bell in the back of our community room that we call the Sangha Hall, and it's a train bell. And a good friend of mine, his wife had cancer, and he had this train bell over in the town of Barstow. And she was dying, and she knew she was dying. There was no cure. And she was having a very hard time dealing with it. She was a wonderful lady, a secretary at an elementary school. And if you know anything about education, she was the one in charge. The principal would ask her what he could do, because secretaries in school systems are the power. And I went over at his request and taught her meditation, spent some evenings with her. And after she had passed on, he showed up at the temple one day with a bell and gave it to me. And I said, oh, thank you, oh, wonderful. I'd offered to buy it. He said, no, you can't buy it. It was in his living room. I'd gone there to teach meditation with her. And I saw him a few years later, and I said, you know, that bell is so wonderful that you gave us at the temple. And I never quite understood, you know, I tried to buy it, and you didn't get it. He says, oh, his wife wanted us to have it for teaching her meditation. So meditation is tremendous. It's like exercise. Everybody should exercise. I'll proselytize exercise all day long. If you can't go to the gym, you can always walk. Okay, you can get up and walk a little bit. I'm on oxygen now. Some of you that watch these videos noticed that all of a sudden I had plastic tubes going to me. And I decided the other day, it's very difficult for me to walk, particularly carrying this thing, but inside I have a big concentrator I don't have to carry. And I decided I would get into a regimen of at least for 15 or 20 minutes every day, turning the oxygen up. See, my oxygen goes way low the minute I start doing anything. I'll turn it up real high and walk for 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes back and forth across the room, because I need to do something. I'm doing a little weightlifting. I pick up a weight about this heavy, and I do this. It's 3 pounds, and I do this, and I do this, you know, and because I'm becoming weak like a kitten, and I decided I've got to be doing something here, you know, I've got to take care of Mom. Mom gets all worried. I tell him, oh, when I'm gone, and he goes, oh, don't talk that way. So now I have to say, well, I told him to say before we started talking, I'll be here for at least into my 90s, which I actually believe. But it's easy when you've got limitations to start putting limitations on yourself, and the next thing you know, all the limitations you put on yourself come true, because you created those limitations yourself. The mind is terribly powerful. So Buddhism came over here, primarily in the form of meditation, and people started practicing meditation, and most of the ceremonies, there's a huge Buddhist center. There's actually 2 of them in Los Angeles that are Japanese, where they still do everything in Japanese. Ridiculous. This is 2021, and they're still chanting everything. And Japanese is not a canonical language. Pali is a canonical language. Sanskrit is a canonical language, a holy language. And some people consider Chinese because so much was done in Chinese. But Japanese is not a canonical language. There's no reason for people to be chanting in a language that they absolutely do not understand. You know, the Catholics chanted in Latin, but people that are not Catholic don't realize they had a missal. They could follow the missal and they knew what they were doing, right, Mom?
Yes.
There were no secrets. But you go into a Japanese temple and they start chanting in Japanese, there's nothing tells you what's going on. So all of a sudden it becomes a big mystery, and there's no reason for it to be a mystery. This couple that came here taught me a lot of things real quick. When I started describing temples in Asia, the wife, it was a married couple, the wife said, that sounds like a community center. I said, well, yeah. You see, I've been a Buddhist all my life. This is not a new thing for me. Was never a fad. And I said, well, yeah, of course it's a community center. It's a community center just like the Catholic churches. You know, I went to Catholic school one year, so I had exposure to Catholic church and nuns. I had exposure to the ruler. Oh, yes. But Catholic churches traditionally are community centers. And Buddhist churches, once they built temples, were always community centers. Classes took place there, all kinds of classes. You could have a cooking class. You could have anything you wanted at the temple that belonged to the people. The temple I stayed at in Orange County, the doors were never locked. The kitchen was open. I'd go out in the morning to do my walk, back when I could do a lot of walking, and there'd be people already. They'd gone in and made tea for themselves, and they were having teas and cookies and crackers and drinking tea, and it was 6 o'clock in the morning. Nobody thought there was there was no open-close sign. Now, when it got dark, I think, I really don't know if that kitchen ever got locked, to tell you the truth. I think it was just open all the time. So, I want to talk, in Japan, this thing of practice, Americans have gotten very confused about it. They think if they give a title to a layman, then the layman is on the same level as a monk. And that's not true. I talked about monks last week, that they take a vow of poverty, obedience, and they take more than 3 vows, but I use 3: poverty, obedience, and, come on, Mom, help me here.
Chastity.
Chastity. But they also, they take other vows, but those are the 3 important. They take a vow of stability. Americans don't even understand the vow of stability. I probably really need to talk a lot about that sometime. And stability means that you don't just wander off whenever you feel like wandering off. So, if you belong to a religious order, and you can't be a monk without belonging to a religious order, and you can't have a religious order without having rules. And they call it the rule. And these vows are part of that rule, that you'll do this and you won't do that. So, in Japan, they consider 7 levels, this is what my Japanese teacher taught me, 7 levels of being a monk. And the first level was to become a Buddhist. And they have a name for it, they call it Jukai. You take the precepts, take the 3 refuges, go to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha for refuge, and you keep the 5 precepts of not taking life, not lying, lying or speaking against others, not stealing, not improper sexual conduct, and not becoming intoxicated, or even the Buddha said just don't drink anything at all. And they take those 5 precepts. Those are the most important precepts, and they're the difficult ones to keep. The next 5 for a novice are pretty easy, but that's where you can't have any money. Cannot handle gold or silver. Those are the old rules. They have changed with time. It's very difficult to drive a car and not handle some form of money, because you'd have to keep calling people to come put gas in your car. Hello, I'm in Orange County, I've got 2 gallons left in the tank. Will you drive all the way down here, which for us is about 100 miles, and fill up my gas tank so I can drive back to the temple? No. So the monks will usually carry a gas card, and that's a form of money. Credit cards are money. Checks are money. It's just another form of it. So we become lenient with that. But in Japan, the first thing you do is you become a Buddhist for a month. The second thing is you become an acolyte, or an apostulant, however you want to say it. And these are typically young men, could be women, but the most common are men, in a village that help the village priest. And they're drawn to the church. As a Catholic would say, they're drawn to the church. And they like being there. They like the smells, they like the sound, they like the rhythm, and they can start to help this monk. And most temples in Japan only have 1 monk in. And that monk may be married, or the monk may not be married. And that's the topic of another topic, how that aberration happened in Japan. But about 130 years ago, there was a big change. And I'll talk about that next week. But right now, you could have a married or an unmarried monk living at the temple alone. And the youngster will come around, usually, maybe 10 at the youngest, but more like 12 or 14. They would come around and show a great interest, and the monk would start teaching them to do things. He might, in the beginning, just teach them to ring the big bell. Every morning, ring the big bell. And let people know that the temple's there. In medieval Japan, the big temple bell was used to tell time. And somebody at the temple would go out and ring the bell throughout the day, let people in the village know what time it was. Nobody had a watch. As time went by, he might be asked to, maybe the monk has to do a ceremony. And people go to Zen temples, and by the way, Zen is the second largest denomination in Japan, and we have monks. The Jodo Shinshu, which is the Pure Land, which came with the Japanese workers who came to California to work in the Central Valley and the gold fields and things like this. They don't have monks, they have ministers. So we're talking about monks right now, but they're the largest group in Japan, the Pure Land group, and they have ministers, and they can marry, and they've always been able to marry since the 13th century, because they are ministers. And if you went to visit their temple, they'd probably greet you in a suit, have a tie and a suit on. And during ceremonies, they would put a monk's robe on, remembering that monks wore robes, and conduct their ceremony. So, can you tell that at one time at our temple years ago, I taught a class on Japanese Buddhism? Yes. But we don't do that anymore because nobody asked for it. So, we have these young people that are there, they're 12, 14 years old. In Japan, commonly you graduate from high school at 15. And you have a couple choices. It's just like Europe. You have a couple choices. You could go on to university, or you go to an apprenticeship. An apprenticeship would be any of the manual trades. Even for an artist, and you don't usually think of an artist as a manual trade, but artists work with their hands along with their mind. And so these 15-year-olds who graduate from high school when they're around 16, now they're going to go, and they're either going to go to university, that's the goal, or they're going to go into the trades. Now, if they decide to go to university, just like in England that I know about, they would go for a couple years of prep school, which we would call high school. And they would prepare to go off to university. If they're helping out at the temple, at some point, the monk at the temple, they probably ask for it and he would shave their head. They have done the most important ceremony in Buddhism. They've shaved their head. They probably don't have a beard to shave, but the shaving of the head and the beard is what we call leaving home. You leave the comfort of your home. You leave the comfort of your family. And you go and live someplace else. A misunderstanding that many people have is you don't divorce your family. You can still see your family. You could go visit your family. The family might visit you at the temple. My teacher, my Vietnamese teacher, my Japanese teacher grew up in a temple. His dad was a priest and his mom was the long-suffering wife of a priest. But my Vietnamese teacher, at 12 years of age, went to live at a temple. And he wasn't a novice until he was around 14 or 15 years old. But his dad used to come by every day with a bag of candy, or not every day, I'm sorry, overspeak. Every week he'd bring a little bag of candy for him. And he'd stand outside the gate, and my master would see him, and he would go and say hi to his dad, and his dad would encourage him, how are you doing, and give him the little bag of candy. And later on, after my teacher's family was completely grown up, his dad became a monk after him. Not uncommon in Buddhist countries. So this postulant, or this acolyte, whichever one you want to call them. Usually acolytes are used for the very, very young, and postulants, maybe the next title we want to give him. And he would get his head shaved, and he would be given a black robe to put on. And he would wear it during ceremonies. Kind of like a choir at a Christian church puts on these robes, you know, special occasion robes, and then takes them off when they're done helping out with the ceremony. It's entirely possible that around the age of 14, 15, maybe 16, he would be given novus ordination, and he'd take 5 more precepts. And those 5 precepts have to do with the notion of poverty, that you can't keep money, that you can't have fancy, it said you can't sleep on a high bed or a high chair, and that's fancy furniture that wealthy people would have.
8 minutes.
Fancy furniture that wealthy people would have. You can't wear perfume and garlands, which would attract the opposite sex, but it also would make you look pretty. So it's more than just attracting somebody. It's about making yourself special. Okay? We don't have to worry about combing our hair. I mean, most people would comb their hair before they went out. We don't have to worry about that. I always forget one. It doesn't matter which set of rules I'm doing, I always forget one. I do it blank. So we have no fancy beds, no keeping of money, no garlands or perfume. I've only got 3.
Gossip.
What's that?
He said gossip.
The what?
He said gossip. That's in the...
No, that's in the first 5. But anyway, so next time I'll review those, since we've got a train going here, and I'll have a list for you, because I always forget. Okay, we're almost out of time, but the next thing over here is that young person will typically go to a Buddhist universities. All the sects in Japan have Buddhist universities. Sects is another word for denomination. And they all have their own universities. And so, Komazawa University would be for the Soto Zen sect. And Wadesa would be for the Rinzai sect. And so we go off and we get a bachelor's degree. My Japanese teacher was encouraged to do 1 more year and get a teaching credential, because teaching is a good occupation for monks. And if they need money to run their temple, support their family. And so at that stage, that's number 3. Number 4 is once you come out of the university and you have a degree, you go to headquarters. Now my experience with Soto Zen, Rinzai Zen is a little bit different in the way they do things. Soto Zen actually has a headquarters, and they have 2 main monasteries. And people do their monastic training at the monasteries, and the headquarters assigns people to go out to temples that are empty to take care of them. And so when you're at the 4th level of a monk, you would go and you would work at a temple with a senior monk, senior priest. Usually by this time they start calling him priest, maybe not. And you would learn how to run a temple. Before that, you were helping out. Now, on an ideal situation, and ideal situations are just that. It means that they don't always happen. One of the monks that is very famous in America was named Shunryu Suzuki. He basically started the San Francisco Zen Center. He had this problem, he was poor. So when he went out to the temple at the 4th level, he had never gone to monastery. He could not afford it. It cost money in Japan to go and train at a monastery, with the exception of Eiheiji. So he had not gone to a monastery, but he was still considered a 4th level ordained Buddhist monk / priest. And he worked there for quite a while, and at some point he got enough money and he could go off and train at one of the 2 big monasteries. And that brought him up to the level of 5, roughly. And 5 is what we think of. If you walk into a Catholic church and meet a priest, if he's a 4, he's a deacon. He's helping pastor the priest, or pastor the church. If he's a 5, he is the pastor of the church. So this is within Buddhism, there's all these parallels. And so now he's a 5. And he doesn't necessarily go above that. But if he's intelligent and he speaks well, maybe a little charisma, he will be asked when in his middle age is important with these ranks too, to start giving lectures. And he might go and give a lecture on the Lotus Sutra, or the Vatamsaka Sutra, or the Shuragama Sutra at other temples. And he will plan this lecture so that it's very good and entertaining and illuminating, and he will go down the road and to another temple, maybe on a train. He'll go far away, and he will do a lecture series commonly of about a week. And everybody will come in the evening and hear. I did this in Washington 20 years ago. Everybody came in the evening to hear me talk. And then on the weekend they could come during the day.
And one of those might be on Central Entertainment.
Central Entertainment?
Is that the one you were missing?
Yeah. So he got a title, which basically meant that he could lecture and teach. Typically, those monks had the students. Part of the monk's life training is to teach other people, and so they might have 2 or 3 students living with them who would take care of the temple. And I have a saying that I invented years ago when I had a bunch of students living at the temple with me, and I would go off to teach. While the master is away, the monks will play. I would leave them assignments to do. When I came back, no, they'd been goofing off. And then the final thing, if you're at least 60 years old, you have to be at least 60 years old, and you have taught, the idea is that you've taught monks and ordained monks, then the headquarters might give you the title of Roshi. And Roshi literally means old monk, but could mean, in the Vietnamese tradition, it would mean great master of high standing. In the Vietnamese tradition, we only have 2 ordinations. We have postulants, but usually take 8 precepts and live at a temple and do not necessarily shave their head, might wear a monk's work clothes. On Sundays or Saturdays or whenever they had a celebration, they would wear a very simple layman's robe, and they're deciding whether they like the idea of being a monk, and then they take 10 precepts. And that's their first ordination as a monk. And then 2 to 4 years later, they take full ordination, have to keep 250 rules, and they begin their training on how to run a temple. And after 5 years, they can go anywhere they want, because they have to do 5 years of training. And then after that, we have to hope that they know what they're doing, and that they can do the necessary ceremonies and teach the necessary lessons. And if they're going to do what I call pioneering work, go out and start a temple, they can pull that off. Or they can stay and support the temple they're at, because their master's getting old. And at some temples you'll see where the master gets really, really old, a few of the really good monks will stay around, because they know somebody's got to fill in the gap. And so next week I'll talk about what happened in Japan.